The next presentation is by three members of the Raheny Heritage Society. And my name is Joan Sharkey, and I am giving the first presentation. There are three short presentations. The origin of the Raheny Heritage Society goes back to 1984, when a series of lectures on tracing your family history was held in Raheny Library over the month of July 1984. Following these lectures, Ray Wickham, who was a dedicated amateur genealogist, started a small group which met regularly in the library to further their interest in researching their own family history. Later, it was suggested to extend the activities of the group to include local history, and in January 1987, the Raheny Heritage Society was founded by Ray Wickham. And he was a great mentor and a great leader of the group, and helped everybody in their research. And in memory of Ray Wickham, who died in 1996, the Raheny Heritage Society hold a memorial lecture in his behalf every year in Raheny Library. It was under Ray's suggestion that our very first lecture or exhibition on the Dublin Raheny Past, which was held as part of the Dublin Millennium Exhibition of 1988. And members collected old photographs, interviewed old relatives, or residents, I should say, living in Raheny, as well as researching in the local archives. And this was resulted in a great exhibition which went on for many weeks in Raheny Library. And it attracted a large interest by everybody. And one of the most interesting aspects was this model of Raheny village, which was done by Niamh Dunn, who is the daughter of one of our members, Mary Dunn. And it shows the Howth Road up here with Main Street looking down, and you can see the two churches, St. Assam's Catholic and St. Assam's Church of Ireland, and Dick's Charity School, and many other buildings which are still there today. It was also RTE came out and did a program on the exhibition. Now, we were very lucky that we had in Raheny a parish magazine that was started in 1960 by the Monsignor William Fitzpatrick, and he researched and wrote many articles on the local history of Raheny and its people, and it was a great starting point for us in the society to do research. And also around this time, a few local history books were published of the area. But I also would like to mention there was a survey done of 4 graveyards: Raheny, Coolock, Grange Abbey, and Kilbarrack. And this was published as a book called Here Lieth. The next big exhibition that we were involved in was in 1991, and was celebrating Dublin Year of Culture, and it was on St. Anne's and the Guinness family. This exhibition was held in the Red Stables and opened by Jerry Barry, who was the head of the Parks Department, Dublin City Council, and it was also held later in Raheny Library, and again attracted a lot of interest. And again, Niamh Dunn, the daughter of Mary Dunn, and Mary, you can see, is the lady on the extreme right here of the picture, with another model that she did at this time of the mansion of St. Anne's, which was on display. We then got involved with publication, and the first one was the Raheny Heritage Trail, which was published in 1992, has been reprinted several times and updated, and recently, even this summer, republished. And it's a walking tour around Raheny village. We then got involved in another major undertaking, which was transcribing the census returns of Raheny from the originals held in the National Archives of Ireland. Now, this is long before there was any thought of putting this, digitising it or putting it up online for everybody to see. So we did Raheny. We also did transcribed Clontarf, and it was divided into Clontarf East and Clontarf West because such a big area and a much bigger population than Raheny. And the dividing line between the east and west was the St. Lawrence's Road. Another very interesting publication we did was Raheny Memories, and this was done by Joe Bell, who wrote in 1988 about his memories of the 1930s and 40s of growing up in Raheny village, but he also expanded and walked around the whole area up to Kilbarrack and back. So it's a very good history and memory of the area when it was very much a rural village. And we published that in 2015. A very big undertaking, which involved all the involved quite in the community of Raheny, was we had the Federation of the Raheny Residents, we had the Raheny Business, and we celebrated 150 years of the Dublin and Drogheda Railway in 1994. Now, the brainchild of this was our late member, Kathleen O'Connor, who you will see here in the centre, and it was her idea and inspiration to reenact this, and it was a great success. And people dressed, as you can see, in period costume. The train was laid on by Éireann Rodairn, and it went from Dublin, or from Raheny, all the way to Drogheda and back. And Kathleen engaged an actor, Eamon Rowan, seen here on the left-hand side, who played the part of Daniel O'Connell and gave his address. There are two plaques to commemorate the event. One is in Drogheda, and this is the one in Raheny railway station, which you can see any day. And it was a great success. We've got involved in doing heritage walks over the years. This was with Kathleen at one stage around the village. And this is with Arthur Garrett, the author who wrote the book on All Saints Church and the Raheny area. And he gave us a talk around the church. Another collaboration with All Saints Church was Harvest and Heritage, and it was one day in October 1996 where we had exhibitions and talks, as well as a guided tour of the church and afternoon tea, and that was a great day. Our major publication was really Raheny Footprints, which we published in 2009 and have now reprinted it again in 2020. And it is based on about 20 men and women who lived at various times in Raheny and really have left their footprints in the sands of time. The actual cover is from a painting by Edward MacFarland from 1853, and it just shows you the view of what Raheny looked like with how high the Rath was in 1853. And you can see the top of the church in the graveyard with the street or main street. We're looking at it from the back. We were very privileged that Roddy Doyle launched this Footprints in Raheny Library, and this is a photo of Roddy with his two parents, Rory and Ita, who were members of the Raheny Heritage. And this particular funny photograph of us all laughing is because Roddy said, this is the first time anyone asked me to sign a book I didn't write. So another collaboration with the Tidy Village Group and Raheny Business was, and with Dublin City Council, these location panels which were erected, and we provided the text for these, as well as the 15 blue historical plaques on historical buildings around the village. And the two location panels, one is outside the Raheny graveyard there, and across the road is the other one outside the Catholic Church. 100 years, this celebration of the life of the death, really, of Dr. Mary Elizabeth Hayes, who was a missionary doctor, and we held that she died in India, and we celebrated that with All Saints Church 2008. And there was a short prayer service at the cross with both the rector of All Saints and the curate from Raheny Parish. And then we adjourned for a choral evening song in All Saints Church. This was followed by an exhibition about Mary Hayes and her life, which is most interesting. We usually up to recent times, organise an annual day trip. And this is just a photograph taken of one year that in 2000, that we went to Clonmacnoise. In Heritage Week, we usually have some walk or something organised, and this is the walking tour that I gave of the Follies in 2014, which attracted a lot of people. As you can see, there was an awful lot of graffiti on these Follies, but we're delighted to be able to say they have been restored, and this is what the Carolan temple looks like now today. Another big collaboration with the Raheny Heritage Society and the Clontarf Historical Society was the launch of the Battle of Clontarf Heritage Trail. We also had organised lectures down in the Classic in Alfie-Byrne Road. And as you can see, the main motivator for all of this was this lady in the centre, Colette Gill, and she's a member of both the Clontarf and the Raheny societies, and she did Trojan work, all voluntary, to get this organised. And personally, I think there should be some plaque to commemorate all the work she did. We've collected a large amount of photographs, and this is the Rose Festival, where we usually display our photographs every year, and always attract great interest. So since the lockdown, we had to only have meetings on Zoom, but our chairman, Douglas, encouraged us to do some writings or short articles about local history or family history. And these are the jottings that we did during lockdown. And in September 2021, we did participate in the Dublin Festival of History, and this was a local history tour through Clontarf, Killester and Raheny, and was examining the Howth Road as it went through these places, and was presented by the Raheny Heritage Society with the support of the Raheny Library. And this will finish my presentation, and I will now hand over to Noel. Carolan.
That's great, Joan. Thanks. So this section is all really dealing with the village, just some aspects of the village. And of course, the graveyard is central to the village today and has been central to it over all of the years. And as the map shows in the center of the screen is where the graveyard is. The arrow is pointing to All Saints Church, the church that was mentioned quite a lot by Joan in the earlier part of the presentation. Now, if we were to go back to, say, 1911, which is when this map was largely made, and you can see the trains going by in the background just to kind of show the location for it. But if we were looking at that area then, as opposed to where it is and how things are there today, the overwhelming difference really is the extent to which Raheny village was way out in a rural heartland. All of the area all around is all green fields. In fact, if you were to start with Howth Road down at Clontarf and to walk the whole of Howth Road was built up in 1911 pretty much until you get to Killester, and then you were out into the heart of the countryside until you came to the small little village of Raheny, which you passed through quite quickly because it is a small village at that point, and then out into the countryside again before you would get to the sea. Now, if alternatively you had stopped in the village for a little time and you were to stand at the bridge, more or less shown there where the red arrow is, you would see the building on your left, the old RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary Station or Barracks, was there on the left. It's a building that's still there today. Another building that you would see in 1911 was Dick's Charity School, also there at the top of the village when you're standing at the bridge, and directly between you and the graveyard. Of course, it's a restaurant today and has been for quite a while. Another building that you could just about see standing from the bridge is the one that's indicated as SMY with the full stop there in the middle of the map. That is because it was a smithy or a forge, and in that image that we have there, you can just see the outline of it, and you can see the outline of it in the village today. It's well worth having a walk around the village to see the extent to which there are so many of what were original buildings around it. all of those buildings come from a single photograph. And this single photograph is a good while after 1911, because that car really wouldn't have been there in 1911. And if we were to push that car, so to speak, out of the photograph, we would be left with an image that is very, very close to what it would have looked like in 1911. And the graveyard is, as I say, behind the main building there, which is Dick's Charity School, in the centre, more or less, of the photograph. Now, if you were to go down to All Saints Church and pass by it a little further, you get to Venetian Hall. It's a name that's still in the area. But the building that gave the name to the area, Venetian Hall, it's a farm building or farmhouse, large farmhouse, is well gone, long gone at this point. And in 1911, this is where it was on the map, and all of around that area was indeed Greenfield too. And you can see the various Forry Park roads and Sybil Hill roads, the roads that lead down into Clontarf. They weren't there in 1911. They followed in a few decades thereafter. Why are we really looking at Venetian Hall? Well, because there's some very interesting material from round about 1911 there. That household, like all the other households in Ireland, filled out census forms. And census forms are really useful because we can actually obviously see what people were living there, but we can find out a lot about the people, and importantly, we can find out a lot about the buildings and the circumstances of the people. And we're very fortunate in Ireland because we do have the 1911 and the 1901 census available from the National Archives website and available free. This is material that's not free in most countries. In any event, looking at this house, what we find there is, on census night in April 1911, Margaret Dunn is a widow living in the household. She's the head of the household and using the terms, if you like, or the language of a census. Her two adult children, Thomas and Mary, also reside with her, along with their domestic servant. That they have a domestic servant is probably the first indication of the extent to which it's a somewhat different household. It's a household of some circumstance. Margaret signs the form, and you can see her signature there. And indeed, you can also see the extent to which it's quite different to the signature that actually, to the writing that completed the form. Not unusual. Oftentimes, the person who signs it as the head of family or the head of household is not the person who completed the form. So what else can we find out about it? Well, we can find out an awful lot of information from that census return about Margaret. She owns what is classified as a first-class house. It has stone walls and a slate roof, 7 to 9 rooms, which is substantial, 6 windows on the front, but most significantly, in a sense, there are 17 outhouses. Moreover, there's even a lodge. And the census information is sufficiently good to tell us what types of outhouses there were. And you can see all of them down along on the right-hand side of your screen, and that indicates the extent to which, obviously, it's a farmhouse and there are outbuildings associated with the running of a farm. Now, that was in 1911. And if we move a little bit up through the years and in through the First World War years, we can find out quite a good deal in the newspapers about Venetian Hall and the family that lived in Venetian Hall. First World War was a very significantly important time for farming and agriculture in Ireland. It was a profitable time, a very profitable time. However, we can see a good deal of information from the newspapers about this farm that Margaret had. First of all, she had 2 farms, and in total, the acreage that she had was about 1/3 of the size of what we would know as the ground that is within St. Anne's Park today. So that's substantial land, good land, on the fringes of the city, and we know even more about it than that from the newspapers. We can look at 1918, for example, and find references to that farm in Venetian Hall and see that there were 14 farm horses in it. This is the first thing that tells us this is not a dairy farm or a cattle farm, a beef farm, so to speak. It's a working farm, a mixed farm with lots of tillage, and you can see the various different pieces of agricultural machinery that are recorded in that newspaper entry that refers to 1918. So, there is a notice about that farm, if you like, in 1918, in September 1918, that's very, very interesting. It is, tragically enough, in fact, for that farm, exceedingly tragically, it is the death of Thomas Dunn, the young man who is the farmer. He's only 36 years of age. Interestingly, it says he had a short illness. Possibly even more interestingly, the funeral is going the following day from the house to Kilbarrack churchyard that was mentioned earlier by Joan in the slides earlier. So we're also lucky in Ireland because for that particular time and era and a little bit afterwards and a good deal before it, we can find out all kinds of information about deaths, births and marriages. And in this particular instance, when we look at Thomas Dunn, we can see on his death certificate, so to speak, well, it would be his certificate. This is a record from which a death certificate would be generated. But nonetheless, we can see that he was a man, a bachelor, 36 years of age, and as we found, not surprisingly, he is a farmer. More interestingly, however, we can look at what was the cause of death. Two things are really important about this. First of all, it's something called lobar pneumonia. This was a cause of death frequently used when someone died from a flu, from a particular flu, the 1918 flu, one of which we heard a good deal in more recent times because we had a pandemic which was not unlike that in the last short time. The other thing that is significant is he was ill for just 2 days. A striking feature of the 1918 flu was the extent to which people, often extremely healthy people, young people this man's age, died suddenly, or not long ill, in other words. And there was, on the occasion when Thomas died, his sister Annie Walsh was there. So she's obviously a sister who is married. Her surname is not the same as his. So Joan mentioned it earlier, and here it is again, Kilbarrack churchyard. I went up there one day to look for the headstone. I spent ages looking for it, and really spent ages looking for it because I hadn't thought about it properly. Thinking about this properly, you would go into this graveyard expecting to find a reasonably big headstone because this was a significant family in the area in terms of its financial circumstances. Their headstone, in fact, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest one in the graveyard. And when you look at that headstone, you can see some details of how it is that his mother was a widow, because you can see the death of his father, I think it's in 1905, and more importantly, you can see the death then of the man we're kind of interested in at the moment, of Thomas C. Dunn in 1918, when he was just 36. So, moving along then, you can actually see in the newspapers, in this instance in the Evening Herald, quite a good detailed piece of information, again reflecting the status of this family. This is not an ordinary family in the townland, if you like, or in the general community. It talks about the numbers of people who were there, their relationships to the family, the celebrants, and all of that type of thing. And the newspaper then tells us something very interesting. Only a matter of a few months later, in the middle of December, more or less, the 18th of December, Margaret has an auction. She is selling off, not surprisingly, 14 farm horses, a yearling horse, a number of ponies. In fact, she is auctioning off everything from the farm because a profound problem, if you like, and crisis has arisen in the death of her son. The farmland no longer has a farmer to farm it. This is a very gendered era. This is not something like it might be today, but in many instances during the 1918 flu, sole trading events areas, whether they were kind of farms or shops or licensed premises or whatever, had grave difficulties when, if you like, the single person operating it died. And that's what happened here. And it's a very interesting thing if you want to spend some time looking at all of the material that was for sale. Interesting because this is not a farm that was prepared for sale and therefore didn't have all of the normal material and all of the normal implements around it. This is a farm that was working in its absolute prime only a few weeks ago. Only a few weeks earlier, everything on this farm was there for a purpose. It's a really progressive farm. So for people who might be interested in the farmland of the day or in the farming practices of the day, it's a good example of the auction details from a farm, which is useful Well, because, as I said, it is a circumstance where the farm was sold while it was a going concern. Much more tellingly, there is another auction a day later. Margaret, in this instance, is seeking to sell, although it seems that it didn't sell on that occasion. She was, however, seeking to sell the land. So the farm is so compromised that it cannot continue, and she is prepared to dispense with it. However, in 1919, in the newspaper, we can find out some more information that in early January, Margaret is looking for somebody who might take up residence in the Gate Lodge and would be able to take charge of a pony and trap. Because when you think about it again, not only has the farm lost its farmer, she has lost the person who would have provided her transport and would have driven the pony and trap, it would appear. By the time we get well into the year, in September, Margaret is still looking for somebody to take up residence and is happy to have a man who might be aged about 40. We don't really know why there's a particular interest in having a man of 40, but in this instance, she's happy to have a man of 40 who might be married, provided he doesn't have any family, which in Ireland means any children, and therefore this is an indication that at least by September, she hasn't yet presumably found somebody who's going to stay there. And finally, then, there is a more interesting piece of information in the newspapers about the farm in the period between there, and that is a marriage, and a more happy event, obviously. And it was the marriage of Mary, who you might remember was 19 in the census in the earlier slides that we saw earlier. And in this instance, she is getting married. So, just to kind of round up that material, the important thing about it is to try and provide some bit of context, really, for that man's death. Very conservative estimates indicate around about 40 million died during the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. It potentially could be as high as 100 million. As we know today, it's very difficult, even in the world of today, to determine how many might die in such a set of circumstances. Nonetheless, the death certificate information that we saw is one of what are about 23,000 in Ireland that are attributed to the influenza pandemic. The most deadly of what were 3 distinct waves happened in October of 1918. It started, you see, in it started in June of 1918. The second wave was in October of 1918, and there was yet another wave in the spring of 1919. And in October, when Thomas died, the newspapers were talking about there still being 400 cases in Howth and in Baldoyle. Now, of course, lots of people didn't die and lots of things went on. Among them was actually the birth of my father. My father was born, as it happens, between the second and the third waves of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. So life did go on for obvious reasons. Now, if we look at it in a little more detail, the newspapers tell us quite a good deal about it. This is a report on the views of Sir Charles Carolan, a monumental figure in terms of health in Dublin, the equivalent of what will be the CMO of today, and whose centenary is being celebrated, as far as I can remember, this year. Now, in the piece of reportage about Carolan and what he had to say, he was making the point that it was curious that the townships didn't have a greater difficulty than the poorest, that the townships had a greater problem than the poorest portions of Dublin. And that rings true for the example we have, because this man was living far from poverty. And he says, even more curious still, that the present outbreak has been traced to Howth and from whence it had spread to Dublin. So there's some kind of an understanding that the Dublin outbreak in October had somehow started in Howth. Probably not very exact the way this might be actually measured, but that was the perception around it. Of more clarity, however, was the fact that at that point, over 20 employees of Dublin Corporation had succumbed to the influenza. And the final little piece here is important in terms of the nearby Clontarf district. It's only down the road, you can throw a stone to it. And this report is saying a father, after burying 2 sons, returned to his home to find his wife dead. Of 2 other members of his family who were then ill, a son has still passed away. There were actually, unfortunately, in the newspapers of the period, quite a number of those kind of incidents. And that is largely as much time as we have to look at that particular family in 1918. And it's now time to hand over at this stage to Douglas.
Thanks, Noel, and I have to follow that. My name is Douglas Appleyard, and I chair the Raheny Heritage Society meetings. So far, we have heard about our local history from different viewpoints. Yesterday, John Tierney and pupils from 4 secondary schools recorded history to be made available online on historicgraves.com. This morning, Grace O'Keefe has looked at Raheny up to the 1640s. Ruth McManus then showed us a different perspective from that time onwards. Joan Sharkey has given us a smidgen of what the Heritage Society has done over the years. And Noel has tantalised us with some scenarios of offering further opportunities for research. This stage of the project has been brought about by Dublin City Council North Area Office, DCC Parks and DCC Central, including Heritage Archaeology and more, all under the excellent coordination of Joan O'Sullivan. Thank you, and thanks to all involved. There is no such thing as a free lecture. So I want to enthuse some of you, even all of you, to join in and enlarge our knowledge about our area and its past. There is so much information online which can be researched from home under your own steam or as part of the RHS team. Maybe you picked up stories when young. Different skills are needed: typing, transcribing, digging for facts, specialist knowledge such as nature, building, industry, farming, statistics. We can all be guardians, researchers, and recorders of our heritage. You could even use PowerPoint, as we have here for this talk. Currently, we have 3 projects in hand where you might like to become involved. The first one is the Old Clontarf project. We are republishing Fred Noel's book, Old Clontarf, where he talks about his young days in the 1920s. And here's Fred and his wife on their wedding day. We have transcribed the early Raheny Church of Ireland registers ready for inclusion on the RCB Library website. Here is the earliest page from the burial register dated 1815. Take the first 3 entries. Sadly, 3 children from the one Sanderson family. From the same page, Miss Mary Wade of Wade's Lane fame, and also John Crow of the previously mentioned forge. Still to be done, the minute books from 1798 to 1848, and the tithes to go with it, the church warden's accounts. We are collecting information about the Howth Road from Fairview to Blackbanks, using deeds, street directories, newspapers, and so on. Our next task is to write it up for another book, and you too can help us. So what can you still research? In buildings, we must not forget their surrounding estate. For each big house, what a trail of information is out there waiting to be collated and written up. As the tithes came to an end, the Ordnance Survey and the Griffith surveyors kept details and measurements in a series of notebooks, house books, field books. From the house books, we can find out size and an approximate age, Here we have Main Street. They're the church details. Dick's Charity School. Both are coded to indicate a slated roof and different ages. Sometimes there is a bonus with more information. Let's look at two more. Again from Main Street, we have Margaret Maguire. And another of Margaret Maguire's places which she has let. One is a public house, a great deal of business. Griffith's valuation adds to our knowledge. And with the council books, provides a 100-year trail of occupation and improvements. Maps are so useful. Here's Raheny in 1838, but that's it 80 years earlier. And here's a 1970 updating showing the new chapel and National School. Townlands. What caused townlands to have such unusual shapes? And where are their boundaries? We can still see walls which mark the boundaries of estates, fields, or townlands. There are many walls. How much remains? Here is at the bottom of Hollybrook Park. This valuation map shows the boundary separating the civil parish of Killester from Clontarf on each side. The walls are still extant in the back lane of Hollybrook Road and the lane at the side of the yacht. The newly planned St. Lawrence Road runs down the centre. We need a photographer to record these walls while they are still around. How many different kinds of railings, village pumps, phone boxes, manhole covers, and so on are in your area? Who manufactured them? We should be recording all of these old trees. Newspapers online. How old is this bridge? Is it the same as McFarlane's 1858 painting mentioned by Joan? Height of bridge is different. From this paper, it looks as if the bypass was being planned in 1809, so some time after that. The railway track crossing Eatonmore Estate is missing. Why? Further subjects to explore. What were the local crops? Noel showed us some typical adverts which can help us. There must have been an abundance of grain at one time, as we know of 2 windmills and 1 motor mill. But where were the barns? 2 main rivers cross the parish, the River Santry through the village and the Nanican through St. Anne's, plus many minor streams and land drains, providing drinking water for humans, animals and industry. They may have been acting as sewers as well. The Raheny Quarry is under the public park at Eatonmore, an important resource for the community. Its limestone was used for building stone, as quicklime for mortar, whitewashing, and as a soil improver. Most old walls in the area were limestone. What about social services? Policing, RIC, parish constable, petty sessions, doctors, the dispensaries, hospitals, the famine, even the Raheny beadle, letters and messages, mail coach and highwaymen, telegrams. We need to find out more. And what about this hamlet near Marino Crescent, sacrificed for the railway? Was Raheny ever like this? It was idyllic in 1858. You can see this old church there at the top. And in this case, it can be seen behind the charity school still with its roof intact. But today, Raheny still has its own charm. My last question to you: can you find some time to discover and preserve our local history? As I said earlier, thank you for listening.